I was the most expensive, most hated, and most successful defense attorney in the city. If you had enough money and a high enough body count, I was the man you called to make the world forget what you did. I was a magician. I could turn bloodstains into spilled wine and murder weapons into unfortunate misunderstandings. I lived for the adrenaline of the courtroom, the way the air felt electric when I dismantled a witness or found that one tiny microscopic crack in a police report that could sink an entire case. I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was the smartest man in every room I walked into. But let me ask you something. Have you ever been so focused on the mountain you were climbing that you didn't realize the ground was crumbling beneath your feet? Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I really need to know I'm not the only one who has ever been blinded by their own ego. And if you've ever felt like life gave you a second chance to fix a massive mistake, make sure to subscribe because what happened next is something I still struggle to believe myself. My downfall didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a parking garage under a bridge smelling of damp concrete and old exhaust. I had just finished the closing arguments for Roman Black. He was young, charismatic in a terrifying way, and the leader of a cartel that was flooding the streets with enough poison to kill a generation. The prosecution had 10 years of evidence against him. 10 years of sweat and blood from a detective named Wyatt Reed. And I destroyed it all in 6 hours. I walked Roman out of that courtroom a free man, his smile as bright as the flashbulbs of the cameras waiting for us outside. 2 hours later, I met Roman in that garage to collect the rest of my fee. I expected a handshake and a briefcase. Instead, I saw the cold black circle of a 9mm barrel. Roman didn't look grateful. He looked bored. He told me that a man who knows how to hide a monster's tracks is a man who knows too much. He thanked me for the freedom, then he pulled the trigger. The pain wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a sharp sting. It was an ice-cold wave that swallowed everything. I remember falling the rough grit of the pavement against my cheek and the sound of Roman's car driving away, leaving me in the dark. I died thinking about my bank account and the fact that I'd never get to wear my new Italian suit. That was the hollow, pathetic end of Gideon Cross. But then I felt a gasp. Not a metaphorical one, a violent, lung-burning heave of air. My eyes snapped open. The ceiling was stained with yellow watermarks. The air smelled of stale coffee, cheap cigarettes, and the kind of loneliness that sticks to the walls. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, uncoordinated, and old. My hands, they were different. They weren't the manicured, soft hands of a lawyer who only held gold pens. These hands were scarred, the knuckles swollen, the skin rough and calloused. I stumbled toward a small, cracked mirror hanging over a cluttered dresser. I didn't see Gideon Cross. I saw a man in his late 40s with deep bags under his eyes and a week's worth of graying stubble. I saw Detective Wyatt Reed, the very man whose career I had just incinerated in court. The man I had mocked for being slow and unprofessional. I moved through the apartment like a ghost in someone else's life. It was a one-bedroom wreck filled with empty takeout containers and files, hundreds of files. On the center of the living room wall, there was a corkboard pinned with photos of Roman Black. It was a wall of failure. Every photo had a red X through it, where a witness had disappeared or a piece of evidence had been thrown out by a judge because of me. My own legal motions were pinned there like trophies of my cruelty. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped in the skin of the man I had destroyed. I was living in the wreckage I created. My heart hammered against a ribcage that felt too tight. I reached out to touch the wall of failure, my fingers trembling as they brushed against a photo of a crime scene I had helped cover up. The weight of 10 years of Wyatt's wasted life settled on my shoulders, heavier than the bullet that had killed me. I walked over to the small kitchen table where a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat next to an open folder. I sat down, my new heavy bones creaking as I lowered myself into the chair. I pulled the folder toward me. It was the original arrest report for Roman Black, the one I had torn to shreds in front of the jury just days ago. My eyes. Wyatt's eyes began to scan the lines of text, seeing the loopholes I had exploited not as victories anymore, but as open wounds. I reached for a pen, a cheap plastic thing that leaked ink and circled a specific date in the margin. air, I could feel the phantom ache in his lower back, the residue of 12 hours spent sitting in a cold surveillance van waiting for a break that I eventually snatched away from him in a courtroom. It wasn't just a legal victory anymore. It was a decade of a man's life turned into a punchline. I stood up, my knees popping with a sound that Gideon Cross's expensive trainer-led body never made. The apartment felt like a tomb of missed opportunities. I waded through the sea of discarded files. My lawyer's brain began to hum, vibrating against the skull of a detective. It was a strange, dissonant symphony. I knew exactly where the skeletons were buried because I was the one who had provided the shovels. Roman Black thought he was untouchable because he was following the safe harbor blueprint I had drafted for him, a complex web of shell companies and maritime logistics that exploited the gaps between state and federal jurisdiction. I grabbed a worn leather jacket from the back of the chair. It smelled of cheap detergent and old regret, and headed out the door. The city looked different from the seat of a beat-up 2014 sedan. The neon lights of the high-rises where I used to dine felt distant, almost mocking. I drove toward the precinct, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure anxiety. Could I pull this off? Could a man who spent his life protecting the devil suddenly wear the badge of the archangel? Entering the station was like walking into a lion's den where the lions already knew I was easy prey. Nate Collins, a younger officer with a face full of unearned optimism, looked up from a mountain of paperwork. He didn't see the man who had humiliated his partner in court. He just saw a tired, broken Wyatt Reed. He sighed a sound of deep, exhausted pity. He told me to go home, that the captain was already looking for my badge after the disaster of the trial. I didn't listen. I walked straight to my desk, Wyatt's desk, and began to pull up the digital records of Roman's recent imports. The beauty of the safe harbor strategy was its reliance on a specific bureaucratic delay in the port of Los Angeles. I had told Roman that as long as his cargo stayed in Transition Zone B for less than 48 hours, it couldn't be searched without a Tier 1 federal warrant, which usually took 72 hours to process. It was a perfect mathematical loop, but there was a flaw, a tiny serrated edge I had left in the contract just in case Roman ever tried to stiff me on my bill. I never thought I'd be the one using it to put a pair of cuffs on him. I began typing, my fingers flying over a keyboard that was missing the R key. I wasn't looking for drugs. Drugs could be moved, hidden, or burned. I was looking for the paper trail of the mistake. To maintain the safe harbor status, Roman had to file a specific environmental impact form for every crate of industrial chemicals he imported. If that form contained a discrepancy in the weight, even by a few grams, the maritime insurance became void, and the safe harbor protection vanished instantly. Nate leaned over my shoulder, his brow furrowed. He asked what I was doing. His voice hushed as if he was talking to someone having a mental breakdown. I didn't look at him. I told him that we had been looking at the front door while Roman was leaving the back window open. I explained the loophole, but I didn't explain it like a cop. I explained it like the man who had built the door and the window. I told him we didn't need a drug dog. We needed an auditor. For the next 6 hours, we stayed in that dim, buzzing office. I felt a strange sense of alignment. For the first time in my existence, both of them, I wasn't twisting the truth to win. I was using the truth to fix what I had broken. We found it at 3 a.m., a shipment of agricultural-grade fertilizer, arriving at Pier 42. The manifest listed the weight in kilograms, but the insurance filing signed by Roman's shell company used pounds. It was a clerical error that would have been ignored by anyone else, but to a lawyer, it was a blood trail. We didn't have much time. Roman was already moving his largest shipment of the year, emboldened by his recent acquittal. He thought the police were paralyzed by their loss in court. He thought Wyatt Reed was at home drinking himself into a stupor. He was wrong. I led Nate and a small, skeptical tactical team down to the docks. The salt air bit at my skin, and the sound of heavy machinery groaned in the distance like a restless beast. We stayed in the shadows, watching the cranes lift the massive steel containers. My eyes searched for him, and then I saw the black SUV pull up. Roman stepped out looking every bit the king of the world I had promised he would be. He was wearing a coat that cost more than Wyatt Reed made in a year. As the container touched the concrete, I felt a surge of adrenaline that was different from the courtroom. This wasn't about the applause of a jury or a fat paycheck. It was about the cold, hard reality of justice. I stepped out from behind a stack of pallets, the flashlight in my hand, cutting through the fog. Roman looked at me, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a threat. He saw a nuisance. He laughed a high, sharp sound that echoed off the metal walls of the pier. He asked if I was back for more humiliation if I hadn't had enough of him making me look like a fool. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply held up the voided insurance manifest. I told him the safe harbor was closed for the season. I watched the smile slide off his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He reached for his waistband, but Nate was faster. The click of the safeties being turned off on the tactical rifles sounded like a chorus of finality. We moved in. I was the one who kicked open the latch on the container. I was the one who saw the crates of high-grade narcotics stacked to the ceiling. But as I turned to face Roman as I prepared to read him the rights I had so often helped him bypass, he didn't look like a kingpin anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred that felt strangely, hauntingly familiar. I grabbed his arm to spin him around for the cuffs, my hand gripping the expensive fabric of his sleeve. He spat at my feet, his voice a low hiss, telling me that I had no idea what I had just started. As I forced his hands behind his back, his sleeve pulled up, revealing a small faded tattoo on the inside of his wrist, a tiny stylized compass. My breath hitched. I knew that mark. I had seen it before 20 years ago, on the drawing paper of a 5-year-old boy who cried when I told him I was too busy for his birthday. The world seemed to tilt. The sound of the sirens and the shouting officers faded into a dull roar. I stared at the back of Roman's neck, my heart freezing in my chest as the cold realization began to seep into my bones, deadlier than any bullet. I had told him that Daddy was busy winning, and now, 20 years later, I had found him in a shipping container, the very monster I had coached to perfection. Nate was shouting something about inventory and back up, his voice, sounding like it was coming from underwater. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just kept my eyes locked on that small faded ink mark as we shoved Roman into the back of the patrol car. He didn't fight. He just stared at me through the window, his eyes cold and void of any recognition, yet filled with a burning, ancient resentment. I climbed into the driver's seat of my beat-up sedan, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. We didn't go back to the precinct immediately. I needed to see him alone. I needed to know. I used Wyatt's authority to divert the transport to an old secondary processing facility, a place where the cameras were often glitchy and the walls were thick enough to swallow a scream. As we pulled into the gravel lot, the headlights flickered against the rusted siding of the warehouse. In the interrogation room, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of ozone and floor wax. I sat across from Roman, the man I had spent 10 years in Wyatt's body trying to catch, and a lifetime in Gideon's body trying to protect. He leaned back in the metal chair, his expensive coat now stained with dock grime, looking at me with a smirk that was a mirror image of the one I used to wear in court. He asked me what I wanted. He asked if I was going to try and beat a confession out of him since my legal tricks wouldn't hold up once his lawyers arrived. I didn't use a baton. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a battered leather wallet, Wyatt's wallet, and fished out a small yellowed piece of paper I had found tucked behind a photo of Wyatt's mother. It was a copy of a birth certificate from 2 decades ago. The father's name was Gideon Cross, the mother's name was Clara Hayes, and the child's name was Roman. I laid it on the table between us. I watched his eyes drop to the paper. For a split second, the kingpin vanished. The Roman black persona cracked, and for one heartbeat I saw the 5-year-old boy again. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked back up at me, but his gaze didn't soften. If anything, it turned lethal. He asked where a low-life pig like me got that document. He spat out the name Gideon Cross like it was a piece of rotten meat, telling me that his father was a ghost who had traded his soul for a corner office and a silver tongue. He began to talk then, a torrent of words fueled by 2 decades of suppressed agony. He told me about Clara, about how she had worked 3 jobs while my old self was winning awards on television. He told me about the nights he spent waiting by a window for a man who never showed up. He told me that he didn't become a criminal because he was greedy. He became a criminal to get my attention. He wanted to be so loud, so dangerous that even a man as busy as Gideon Cross couldn't ignore him. But he still didn't come, Roman whispered, his voice cracking just enough to let the pain through. He died in a garage before I could tell him that I finally beat him at his own game. He died without knowing that I was the one who eclipsed him. I felt the room spinning. I wanted to scream that I was right there. I wanted to tell him that I had felt his bullet enter my brain, that I had died by his hand and been sent back to this purgatory just to witness the extent of my own failure. But how do you tell your son you're a ghost inhabiting his enemy's body? How do you explain that the man who just arrested him is the same man who abandoned him? I leaned forward, the light from the single bulb reflecting in the sweat on my forehead. My voice was a rasp, barely audible. I told him that maybe his father deserved that bullet. I told him that maybe Gideon Cross was the real criminal all along, and that Roman was just the evidence of a life poorly lived. Roman laughed, but there was no humor in it. He told me it didn't matter. He told me that his lawyers, the ones I had trained, the ones who used my own safe harbor defense, would have him out by morning. He said that even from the grave, Gideon Cross was still protecting him. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive mints and iron. He told me that once he was out, he wouldn't just kill Wyatt Reed, he would erase him. I stood up, the chair screeching against the concrete floor. The lawyer in me was screaming to find a way out, to find a compromise, but the detective in me, the man Wyatt Reed had been, was finally waking up. I realized that if I let him go, if I used another loophole to save my own flesh and blood, I would be killing him all over again. I would be confirming that the only thing that mattered was winning the game, not the lives caught in the crossfire. I walked to the door, my hand on the cold iron handle. I didn't look back. I told him that the safe harbor wasn't just closed, it was being demolished. I told him that I knew every secret, every offshore account, every hidden ledger, because I was the one who had hidden them. I wasn't just going to arrest him. I was going to dismantle the entire legacy of Gideon Cross piece by agonizing piece. As I stepped out into the hallway, Nate was waiting for me, his face pale and eyes wide. He asked if I was okay, if Roman had said something to me. I didn't answer. I just handed him the file on the mistake we had found earlier, along with a list of names and addresses I had memorized from my old firm's private server. I told him to call the district attorney and the feds. I told him we were going for a RICO indictment. The weight of what I was doing settled into my marrow. To save my son's soul, I had to destroy his life. I had to become the very thing he hated most, the law that wouldn't bend. I walked out of the facility and stood in the gravel lot. The cold rain of a Los Angeles winter beginning to fall, soaking through Wyatt's cheap jacket and chilling me to the bone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter, Gideon's lighter, the only thing I had managed to keep from the crime scene. I flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the wind, and held it to the corner of the birth certificate. I watched the names Gideon and Roman curl into black ash, the smoke disappearing into the dark, wet sky. I was actually building a cage for my own son. Now I was the only one who could tear it down, even if it meant burying myself under the rubble. I drove back to the precinct through the gray morning light, the city waking up around me. People were heading to work, drinking their coffee, completely unaware that the legal architecture of their world was about to shift. I walked straight into the captain's office. I didn't wait for an invitation. I didn't care about the chain of command anymore. I laid out the strategy not as a detective presenting evidence, but as an architect explaining where the structural flaws were in his own building. I gave them everything. Every offshore account number hidden in the Cayman Islands, every bribed official in the Port Authority, and every shell company I had ever registered under a dead man's name. Nate sat in the corner of the room, his jaw dropping further with every secret I spilled. He asked me how I knew all this. I told him Wyatt Reed had been doing a lot of off-the-books reading. It was a thin lie, but in the heat of a major bust, nobody asked too many questions about where the miracle comes from. The next few months were a blur of depositions and courtrooms. It was the ultimate irony. I was finally the star of a trial again, but this time, I was sitting at the prosecution's table whispering into the ear of the district attorney. I watched Roman's defense team, the young, hungry lions I had mentored, try to use the Gideon Cross maneuvers. I saw them try to suppress evidence and twist testimony. And every time they moved, I was 2 steps ahead. I closed every door before they could reach the handle. I was a ghost haunting my own masterpieces, breaking them one by one. The final day of the trial was different from any I had ever experienced. There were no cameras flashing for me. There was no victory party at a 5-star steakhouse. There was just the heavy silence of a federal courtroom as the judge read the verdict. Life without the possibility of parole. Roman didn't look at his lawyers when the words were spoken. He didn't look at the judge. He turned his head and looked directly at me. In that look, the hatred hadn't vanished, but it was joined by something else. A confused, flickering recognition. He saw a man who shouldn't have known his secrets, but did. He saw a man who had destroyed him not out of malice, but with a terrifying surgical precision that felt familiar. I waited until the courtroom cleared. I pulled every string Wyatt Reed had left to get 5 minutes alone with Roman before he was processed for transport to the state penitentiary. We stood in a small holding cell separated by a thick pane of plexiglass. He looked exhausted. The silk shirt was gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit that washed out his skin. He looked less like a kingpin and more like the lost boy I had abandoned in a suburban living room 2 decades ago. He asked me why. He asked why a nobody detective would blow up his own career just to make sure a drug dealer stayed in a cage. I leaned in my forehead, almost touching the glass. I didn't tell him I was Gideon. I couldn't. Instead, I told him that sometimes the only way to save a house from burning down is to let the fire take everything until only the foundation is left. I told him that his father was a coward who didn't know how to love him, but that the man standing in front of him now wouldn't let him become a monster anymore. I'm not Gideon, I whispered, the words tasting like copper and salt. But I'm the one who's staying. I'll be here for every visiting day. I'll be here until you remember who you were before the world told you to be Roman Black. He didn't say thank you. He didn't cry. He just placed his hand on the glass right over the spot where my heart would be. For a second, our palms lined up, separated only by an inch of reinforced plastic. It was the first time I had touched my son in 20 years. Then the guards came. They led him away, his chains rattling against the floor in a rhythmic, somber beat. I walked out of the courthouse and realized I had nothing left. I had handed over enough internal information about my investigative methods that my career as a detective was over. I was being forced into early retirement, likely facing a probe by internal affairs. I had no money, no fancy suits, and a body that ached with every step. I was Wyatt Reed, a man with a stained apartment and a broken car. But as I sat on a park bench across from the court watching the sun dip behind the skyscrapers, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in either life. I had lost the world, but I had found my soul in the wreckage. I had used the law to destroy a family, and then I had used it to try and mend one. It wasn't a happily ever after. It was just a start. If you're still listening to this, I want you to look at the people you've pushed aside to get where you are. Is the view from the top worth the silence of an empty house? Don't wait until you have to die and come back in another man's shoes to realize that the most important case you'll ever argue is for the people who actually love you. Leave a comment if you've ever had to start over from zero. Subscribe if you believe that no one is ever truly beyond saving. I stood up from the bench, tucked my chin into the collar of my worn jacket, and started walking toward the bus stop, my shadow stretching out long and thin across the concrete.